How have I profited that I have bowed down to my God? Perhaps this quote could have been attributed to Noah after he and his family had survived the flood. These could have been words uttered by the likes of Azazel or Mastema in a quiet moment of weakness. However, we are leaving the apocryphal world of Genesis, chapter 3, verses 1 to 8 behind us now. We are moving forward far into the collection of works known collectively as the Tanakh or Old Testament. Our minds shall now be set on one figure who stands out, especially with the extensive character development he has received outside of his original source materials. I am, of course, referring to the figure of the Satan. Perhaps one of the designations most synonymous with evil, the Satan lives rent-free in the minds of all Christians, as well as writers, television, film and video game creators, and yours truly. As alluded to at the end of the last episode, this time around, the focus is going to be on one of the wisdom literature, the Book of Job, as well as any additional references to Satan we can find. There are plenty to cover, believe you me, so we are best to get started. This is Cogito Ergo Pod. I am your host Daniel, and in this episode, we are, believe it or not, going to look at the figure of Satan in the Old Testament. Before we can dive into the good stuff, there is something I want to cover relatively quickly. In the philosophy of religion, a theodicy, meaning vindication of God, is an argument that attempts to resolve the problem of evil that arises when all power and all goodness are simultaneously assigned to God. Unlike a defense, which merely tries to demonstrate that the coexistence of God and evil is logically possible, a theodicy additionally provides a framework wherein God and evil's existence is considered plausible. The German philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Leibniz coined the term theodicy in 1710 in his work Theodicy, though numerous attempts to resolve the problem of evil have previously been proposed. Theodicy literally means justifying God. As defined by Alvin Plantinga, a theodicy is an answer to the question of why God permits evil. Another definition of theodicy is the vindication of divine goodness and providence in view of the existence of evil. A theodicy shows that it is reasonable to believe in God despite evidence of evil in the world, and offers a framework that can account for why evil exists. Pseudo-Dionysius defines evil as those aspects that show an absence of good. Writers in this tradition saw things as reflecting forms, and evil is a failure to reflect the appropriate form adequately, as a deficit of goodness where goodness ought to have been present. In the same line of thinking, St. Augustine also defined evil as an absence of good, as did the theologian and monk Thomas Aquinas, who stated, "A man is called bad insofar as he lacks a virtue, and an eye is called bad insofar as it lacks the power of sight." The idea that bad is an absence of good resurfaces in Hegel, Heidegger, and Barth. Some examples of ancient Near Eastern theodicy are still available to us. One such text, the Babylonian Theodicy, was quoted at the opening of this episode. Another, the 2nd millennium BCE Man and His God, concerns a sufferer complaining to the gods and conceding that none are born sinless. The writing, I Will Promise the Lord of Wisdom, has a sufferer who denies that anyone can know the gods' wills, trusts in their divine mercy, and concludes that the gods have a different value system to us mortals. The Ugaritic text, Epic of Keret, concerns a man who loses his wife and children, but eventually the gods give him a new spouse and offspring. So, really, the most important question we have to ask here is, what does theodicy have to do with anything? Well, it will all make sense soon. Now, let's move on from that and take a look at one of our focuses today, the Book of Job. To be more specific, chapters 1 and 2 of the Book of Job. Likely written during the Persian period between 540 and 330 BCE, the Book of Job is part of the Ketuvim, or writings, found in the Hebrew Tanakh, or one example of wisdom literature in the Christian Old Testament. In a nutshell, Job is one of the best-known examples of theodicy literature. The majority of the text focuses on conversations between the eponymous protagonist and several companions. The Book of Job, through extensive and complex conversations between the characters involved, seeks to explain why evil happens to people, particularly to the figure of Job in this instance. However, the manner in which suffering and evil are introduced to the life of poor Job, outlined in chapter 1 and 2, is far from earthly in origin. Chapter 1 opens by outlining the kind of person Job is. Verses 1 to 5 describe a man who has 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yokes of oxen, 500 donkeys, very many servants, 7 sons, 3 daughters, and a wife. Despite being a man of great wealth, it is his piety which is most important here. Verse 1 makes this clear when Job is described as being blameless and upright, one who fears God and turned away from evil. He even goes so far as to, in verse 5, always make burnt offerings on behalf of his children's sins, both external and in their hearts. What an extraordinary man, and a perfect guinea pig for things to come. Verse 6 to 13 take place far beyond the terrestrial world of Job and in the heavenly court of God, featuring heavenly beings, also translated as sons of God. The Lord then engages a figure in this heavenly council in conversation, the Satan. The crux of the conversation is that God asks Satan if he's aware of the exemplar of piety, Job. The Satan tells God that Job only has everything he does because God made it so. It is in that instance that God agrees to test Job. The Satan is now given the power to take away from Job anything he wants, but he cannot harm the man physically, and so off Satan goes. In verses 13 to 19, we are told about how the Satan causes Job to lose property and children. His oxen and donkeys are stolen by Sabaeans, killing the servants watching over the animals. Similarly, the Chaldeans stole the camels and killed their handlers. The supposed fire of God descends and burns up the sheep and their shepherds. Meanwhile, all of Job's children are eating and drinking at the eldest brother's home when a great wind came and causes the house to fall on them. This seems appropriate right now because I'm recording this episode during Storm Arwen. All of this takes place almost simultaneously. Thank goodness there was one survivor from each of these calamities to tell Job. How does Job respond to all this? Well, probably best just to quote the text to you, found in verses 20 to 22. It goes, "Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, 'Naked I come from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.' In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing." Chapter 2 opens, in verses 1 to 6, back among the heavenly council. God and Satan are discussing Job once again. God, almost poking fun of the Satan's efforts, asked if the latter has noticed the godly and good Job. God goes on to highlight that despite efforts to the contrary, Job continues to be an upright and pious man. The Satan agrees, pointing out that Job still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason. The challenge is now laid down that Job's body should not be safe from being tested. The Satan proposes to make Job suffer physically. God agrees, but stipulates that Job's life should not be in danger. So, off the Satan goes again. Verse 7 and 8 show the outcome of Satan's latest efforts. Job is inflicted with sores all over his body and resorts to scrape them with a shard of pottery. Job's wife makes an appearance in verses 9 and 10. She challenges Job to curse God for all of the suffering he has experienced. His response: "You speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive good from God and not receive evil?" Despite the Satan and the wife's efforts, Job will not sin. The subsequent 40 chapters that follow involve Job having conversations with supposed friends, and finally having a one-to-one with God himself. It all ends with Job not only getting everything back he had lost initially, but he does in fact receive double his original livestock. Job even has the same number of children he had lost, with them once again being 7 sons and 3 daughters. Now, wasn't he lucky? Despite the Book of Job being a prime example of ancient theodicy literature, I do not want to focus on this. Rather, it is the events described in the first couple of chapters that interest me more. To be even more laser-focused, I want to consider the role played by the Satan, initially found in Job, chapter 1, verses 6 to 12. All interactions between the Satan and God take place in a location which is also populated by the heavenly beings. If we assume that it is the same place as God's throne, described in some scriptural sources such as Psalms 11:4 and Isaiah 6, then this collection of individuals may very well be the divine council. See 1 Kings 22:19 and Psalms 82. Whether these beings are other gods, fitting in with the polytheistic Near Eastern religions who also produce theodicy writings, or angels, as preserved by later readings wanting to ensure that the text fits into monotheistic parameters, these figures have a role to play in God's heavenly kingdom. Enter the Satan. Now, you have probably noticed that I have been using the definite article by adding a "the." Well, that is because Satan here is the definite article. In the original Hebrew, it is written as ha-satan, with the ha equivalent to the in English. So if he is the Satan, what is a Satan? The Hebrew term Satan is a generic noun meaning accuser or adversary, and is derived from a verb meaning primarily to obstruct or to oppose. When used without the definite article, simply Satan, it can refer to any accuser, but when it is used with the definite article, ha-satan, it usually refers specifically to the heavenly accuser, literally the Satan. Meanwhile, back in the heavenly realm in chapter 1 of Job, the Satan is among those present before God. True to form, or more like the form we have seen in Genesis, God demonstrates limitations to his omniscience. The first thing asked of the Satan by God is, "Where have you come from?" It may be that God lacks the knowledge of Satan's movements. However, this question may make more sense when we put it into a historical context. Elaine Pagels, in The Origin of Satan, suggests that it is a link between the Satan's role and one part of the Persian political apparatus, the secret police. The Satan responds to the question with, from going to and from on the earth and from walking up and down on it. It may be that the functionary role of the Satan is one of intelligence agent for God. They may be tasked with travelling the world to inform on what is taking place. However, this would still limit the scale of God's powers and suggest that he requires underlings to keep him up to speed with goings-on in the world. It is also unusual to think of any divine beings roaming, as they are often encountered being sent on specific missions with a particular purpose. Interestingly, Pagels also alludes to a play on words between the Hebrew word Satan and the word shoot, meaning to roam. The Satan, possibly as a result of his roaming, is asked by God if he has considered my servant Job, and goes on to expound what a virtuous man Job is. The Satan, possibly seeing an opportunity to play the role of an accuser, claims that God has put a fence around him and his house and all that he has, suggesting that God has given Job some kind of preferential treatment. So, the Satan suggests that God should stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. The Satan clearly wants to have Job tested, and for God to do this. However, God turns the tables and bestows that authority onto the Satan, who may do anything to Job other than harm the man physically. We have already covered the results of Satan's first foray into Job's life, so we shall move on to the next heavenly encounter between the adversary and God. Chapter 2, verses 1 to 3 are more or less the same as those found in chapter 1, verses 6 to 8. We have the heavenly beings, God, and the Satan. However, when God tells the Satan about the righteousness of Job in verse 3, he includes that Job's piety was just as strong despite the Satan's best efforts. God is making a point here, and maybe elevating the status of Job by emphasizing his resilience to so much personal tragedy. Undeterred, the Satan once again calls on God to stretch out your hand, and physically harm Job. Again, God counters this suggestion and bestows that authority onto the Satan, who inflicts terrible sores upon Job's whole body. And once again, the caveat that Job could not be killed shows that God has the power to limit the Satan's authority and still remain in control of the situation. The Satan, acting as an agent of God, is the instrument through which any theodicy discussions can subsequently happen in the book of Job. Without the terror and tragedy experienced by the titular character, there would be no reason to discuss the paradoxical concept of an all-loving God who allows evil in the world. However, the Satan's role here is limited by his definite article. They are there to accuse and to be an adversary to Job, not to God. If early Judaism understood this figure to be as an agent of God, then how or why is the word Satan used throughout the rest of the Old Testament, or Tanakh? The definite article of Satan occurs 17 times in the Old Testament, of which 14 of these are found in chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Job. However, the remaining 3 examples are found in the prophetic book of Zechariah, chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Here, Joshua, a high priest, is brought before God. Also in this company is an angel of the Lord, and the Satan. We are also told that the Satan is there to accuse Joshua. God then, speaking to the Satan, says, "The Lord rebuke you, O accuser." God is calling the Satan out for his role and chastising him. The short scenario at the beginning of Zechariah chapter 3 feels very much like a courtroom drama. This may very well offer an alternative perspective on the character of the Satan, not only in Zechariah, but also in the book of Job. The Satan is a prosecutor. They are tasked with placing individuals on trial and testing their resolve in the face of divine prosecution. To prosecute is to try and prove guilt rather than profess someone's innocence. In both the books of Job and Zechariah, God acts as defense for both the figures of Job and Joshua. However, the authority and power of the Satan to accuse can only come from one source, that of God. However, the instance in Zechariah does not show God giving over any authority to the Satan. Rather, it would appear that the latter is assuming authority independently of God. The Satan could be seen as becoming less an extension of God's power and more like a separate entity with their own agency to accuse and act in contrary to God's will. Meanwhile, there are a number of other examples of the word Satan being referred to and used in the Old Testament. One such instance we have already looked at in a previous episode. In the book of Numbers, chapter 22, we will now return to the story of Balaam and his talkative donkey. For a little more context, Balaam was on his way to help the king of Moab against the Israelite host who had recently escaped Egypt. From verses 22 to 35, the incident between Balaam, his donkey, and the angel of the Lord occurs. This angel is referred to in verse 22, and subsequently identifying itself in verse 32 as an adversary, a Satan. However, the role of this angel is not to bring judgment or suffering down upon Balaam. Rather, it is being sent by God to deter this would-be enemy of the Israelites from going ahead with it. The angel states in verse 32, "I have come out as an adversary, because your way is perverse before me." We have an adversary acting against those who would risk harm on God's chosen people, and in turn is saving Balaam. As Neil Forsyth puts it, if the path is bad, an obstruction is good. Moving on from Balaam, we come to one of the most famous kings of Israel, David. To suggest that the life of David was anything other than colourful would be a gross understatement. However, even during his adventures and exploits, Satan is considered to have made an appearance. There is a story recounted in 1 Chronicles, chapter 21, verses 1 to 17, and in 2 Samuel, chapter 24, verses 1 to 17, which revolves around a census David carries out in Israel. Though both accounts cover the same story, how the census came about differs. The account in 2 Samuel suggests that it was David's own sin that brought about God's wrath upon the kingdom. Why is it a sin to do a census in the first place is unclear, and would use up valuable Satan time here. Nevertheless, David, as a human, has erred in the eyes of God. However, 1 Chronicles, possibly written later than 2 Samuel, lays the blame on Satan. This isn't even a subtle accusation. 1 Chronicles chapter 21 opens with, "Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel." Satan, appearing to act alone, and with no mention of God being present, had King David undertake a census which would lead to the death of 70,000 subjects, thanks to a classic divine plague. 1 Chronicles presents us with a character who is tempting people to act contrary to God's will, and is acting in opposition to the ultimate divine authority. This is a Satan which would be more recognizable to people today, contrary to that found in the books of Job, Zechariah, and Numbers. It would be a fair assumption to say that either 1 Chronicles or 1 Samuel took the story of the census from the other. But that begs the question, was it David's sinfulness or Satan's coercion which came first? We may never know, but it's fun to speculate, if you're into that kind of thing. The last example I want to offer here is that found in the major prophetic book of Isaiah. I'm sure that the moment I said this text, the alarm bells will have been going off in your heads. Daniel is going to be talking about Isaiah 14. Well, you're right. The 14th chapter of Isaiah is well known for its poetic verse. Within this, there is a portion, verse 12, which deserves to be read in its totality here. It goes, "How you are fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn! How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low." If we cast our minds back to the last episode, looking at the apocryphal texts which expanded upon and deep dived into the narrative found in Genesis 6, 1-8, we will recall that there was a lot of casting down going on. Those watchers and angels kept getting themselves cast down into the earth. So here we have a verse that sounds like it could have come from the texts such as 1 Enoch or the Book of Jubilees. As such, through millennia of eisegesis, look it up, this verse in Isaiah 14 has come to be associated with Satan, or more specifically Lucifer, but I'm not going to get into that now. However, Countless people have failed to appreciate what the text of Isaiah 14 is actually about. A large portion of the text, of which verse 12 is part of, is a taunt against the king of Babylon. It is this king who is the morning star, son of the dawn, mentioned in verse 12, not Satan. But isn't this the problem with Satan in the Old Testament or Tanakh? Our perception of who it was has been skewed by countless interpretations and reinterpretations. Through much of the references to it, the Satan, or simply Satan, acts as the shadow, the dark side of God. This being brings accusation, prosecution, and in the case of Job, death, destruction, and disease. Jeffrey Burton Russell describes Satan as the personification of the destructive power of God. In a world where the omnibenevolence of divinity was challenged by the clear and present existence of evil, it would have been necessary to create something that could be blamed. Yes, all the authority of Satan was bestowed by God. And yes, Satan was accountable and answerable to God. However, this could be generally glossed over. Who is prosecuting suffering in your life? Satan. Who was responsible for all those terrible trials and tribulations you were going through? Satan. These things are sent to try us, and Satan was judge, jury, and executioner. Near the start of the episode, I dated the Book of Job to the Persian period. However, there has been suggestion that it could date as far back as sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE. This would make some sense, as it would place it in a similar time period with other theodician texts. Could it have been that Job was the first mention of the Satan, and the progenitor of all subsequent uses and incarnations of the figure? It would be fun if it was. However, there are enough different iterations of it that it could have come from any of the biblical writings, or even from a text that has been lost to us. Other than the nefarious behavior exhibited in 1 Chronicles, Satan tends to act as an extension of God. It has a role which fills the need of early Jewish theology and has been passed down to us through the Tanakh and the Old Testament. However, it is always important to remember the true form of which Satan is presented to us in the texts. This is his original incarnation. What this accuser, this adversary would become, is for another episode. Next time, in our exploration of evil in the Bible, we're going to spring it into the Common Era and into the writings of the New Testament. Not wanting to rush anything, we are initially going to be focusing on the Gospel texts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or maybe I will do them in the order they were written. These texts form the backbone of our understanding of the birth, life, death, and supposed resurrection of Jesus Christ. However, we are going to focus on how evil is represented in the Gospels, and how much of it mirrors anything we have already looked at in the Old Testament and apocryphal writings. I hope you're looking forward to finding out. I certainly am. If you have enjoyed this episode, please subscribe so you are made aware when future episodes drop. You can follow this podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, YouTube, and Blue Sky. As ever, thank you all for listening, and I shall speak to you again soon.